Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Sean McMahon channel here. Today, we got a special guest. We got Philip Jenkins. Now, he's a fantastic author whose works I've talked about a little before. He is Distinguished Professor of History at the Institute for Studies of Religion at Baylor University, as well as Penn State University. He's a contributing editor for the American Conservative. He writes for the Christian Century, Christianity Today, First Things, and The Atlantic. Is there anything I've missed, sir?
That'll do for now.
Let's give a warm welcome to Philip Jenkins.
Hey.
All right. So you are speaking to us from which part of the world right now, sir?
Central Pennsylvania, State College.
State College. All right. And so we were going to meet up a couple weeks ago until I discovered that traveling with a family of 5, 3 little kids, not going to happen. So Mr. Jenkins here was very gracious to meet me online. So let's dive into it. Philip, a lot of my listeners are very curious about lost Christianity. Now, the big question that I want to ask you before we dive into what some of those lost Christianities are that are covered in your book, my question is, do you believe that Christianity can be lost in the sense of, what could be said about the concept of apostolic succession, for instance? Is Christianity something utterly reliant on traditions that historically go back to Christ and the apostles? Could it be therefore lost completely, or could it drop back down from the sky through spiritual inspiration, etc.?
Boy, apostolic succession tends to be a very Western Christian view. Can Christianity be lost altogether? Christianity can be destroyed in particular areas. There are some lands around the world that once upon a time were very strongly Christian and then ceased to be so. Large areas of, for example, Turkey or Iran would fall into that category. It doesn't necessarily mean that Christianity is removed altogether. In fact, it just moves elsewhere. So what I always say about Christianity is if the church really needed a motto, it'd be something like always traveling. It's always moving, which means it's different from Islam. Islam grew in a particular area. It spread over particular regions. It lost the odd corner here and there, but basically it's where it started. Christianity is not. Christianity has moved repeatedly, and I would argue is moving again in our lifetimes.
Absolutely. So in which ways has Christianity traveled? Is it traveling through documentation, through post, through email, right, through YouTube? And what difference might the media of transmission make as the new Christendom expands?
What I argue is we probably spend too much time talking about missions and missionaries and people saying, we're going off to convert that part of the world. What usually happens with all the great religions is that people move for whatever reason, whether it's they want to trade, they want to travel, they want to get jobs, they want to get rich, and they take their religion with them. After they've built up a community, after a while, they worship there in a particular style. And sometimes they'll bring in clergy to take care of things. There's one quote I was like, the first reference we have to Christianity in Ireland is in the 5th century, when a missionary is sent to, quote, the Irish believing in Christ, unquote. So in other words, the Irish are believing in Christ, and then a missionary arrives. Mm-hmm. Not the missionary arrives and spreads Christianity. And I think that's very much what you see today. I mean, if you look at the spread of African churches around the world, there are missionaries, but mainly it's Africans move and the churches come with them after a while.
Mm-hmm. So where I am, Martha's Vineyard, there's a unique example of that type of story where the settler, not the founder, but the first settler, Thomas Mayhew's son, Jr., developed a friendship with a Wampanoag man named Hyakumes. And as the story goes, Hyakumes took an interest in the Christian faith, and he eventually was baptized by Thomas Mayhew Jr. The baptism is immortalized in one of the baptistries or whatever it's called, in stained glass of the National Cathedral. And Hayakumes then went over to the rest of the tribe and evangelized then. But it wasn't until there was a bit of a crop yield there that outsiders from the mainland said, "Oh, let's get in and see what we can do with this." So the Congregationalists came in, but then so the Baptists came in, and eventually, because they realized it was expedient to be independent, they went with the Baptists for the tribal church, because then they could self-govern. So it seems to me that, denomination is, I don't want to say that it's arbitrary, but it seems almost as if it doesn't follow so much a logical pattern of this is the doctrine that makes the most sense. It seems more like you said, this is the tradition I have. I happen to bring it to a new place. It's brand new here, and people are going to come up with their own ideas about it, develop their own traditions. So do you see in this new Christendom that's developing, as you say, mostly in the global South, do you see denominations that are more ascendant than others? And if so, how do their traditions down there compare to the traditions where those denominations may have originated?
Yeah, I mean, if you go to a place with a very fast-growing Christian church like Nigeria, for example, you get a lot of very familiar churches. There are Catholic churches, there are Anglican churches, and there are Presbyterians. And there are also a lot of very, very strong independents. I mean, one church I always follow around the world is something called the Redeemed Christian Church of God, founded in Nigeria in the 1950s and is spread all around the world. If you go anywhere in a big American or European city, you look, and usually you'll find a representative there. So the denominations are there. They will behave differently. Churches tend to have a lot more interest, for example, whatever church they are, in healing, in spiritual powers. You're much more likely to see people moving, using physical movement in worship, just like in African tradition. And over time, that becomes normalized. So it's not that a council sets up and says, "Okay, everyone is now allowed to move." Is what they do anyway, and that becomes the norm for that particular church.
Do you find that the reality of this new Christendom that's growing in the global South, how does it compare to, say, the stories we hear of early Christianity spreading to places in the Levant and beyond, and these practices are taking root, and then someone at central headquarters, whether in in Ephesus or even in Rome, says, "Hey, we got to send these people to curb those practices." I mean, we have this vision, this idea that maybe things were centralized back in those days, and I don't think that's 100% true. So how does that work or compare to what's going on now?
Yeah, if you go back to the early church, there is a lot of latitude by definition. So we have one famous second century story where a senior cleric goes to quite an important church and is just listening to the gospel readings and finds that they're reading a non-canonical gospel. And at that point, they have to say, no, we have an approved list, to which the response is, yeah, well, you haven't had it long. It's not very secure. So there are kind of limitations on what people can and can't do. The biggest single variable is state power. Like in the Middle Ages, for example, if you do something that's out of line, the state will come down on you very hard. If you're in, say, 19th century Britain or 21st century Africa, if you don't like what's happening in your church, you go off and form a new one. And that's very easy. You can do what you want. And at some point, maybe some people will draw a line and say, okay, you've now moved into a cult. But that's a matter of opinion. But that's the reason religion for long periods in history seems to be fairly static. It isn't that everyone is afraid to think. It's just that the state draws firm lines as to what you can and can't do. And I think looks a little bit arbitrary. You look at St. Francis, and he did a lot of things that were very strange. People say, well, yeah, okay, he's a saint. Somebody 2 villages down did the same and got burned as a heretic.
I think you're 100% correct. Yeah. I can't believe some of the things that some of these canonized saints and even doctors of the church, I believe it's St. Catherine of Siena is now a doctor, right? I mean, that would not have flown anywhere else. I mean, Saint Hildegard of Bingen just sort of snuck under the gate too. I mean, but I remember just 20 years ago, people were, she was at origin level, like, we're not sure what we think of this person. So that makes me wonder as well, going back to the idea of lost Christianities. Are we still with? Okay, you're still with me. Your image is frozen. So going back to the idea of lost Christianities, a church, for instance, like the Oriental Orthodox Church in Ethiopia, right, which has a slightly different canon, which kind of privileges the Enochian text and potentially even an Enochian vision or hermeneutic of the Christian faith. There are people today in popular culture or even just internet discourse who are sort of pro-Enoch polemicists. Mm-hmm. And they're trying to dig into this Ethiopian tradition, even though they're Protestants and they're not at all interested in an Ethiopian-style liturgy, right? Mm-hmm. So how often are things like this happening in history? Because, for instance, you read that the First Baptists claim, well, our tradition, though it might look innovative historically, actually we're taking from the original Christian practice. And the only reason you never heard about it is because it was stamped out, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that sounds like a ridiculous claim, but at the same time, we can see indications that can happen to some Christian traditions, world traditions in our lifetime. Like we're watching that play out throughout the world. So what's your take on that?
Boy, big question. You never know how much difference it makes when people have what you might call an odd or unusual scripture. So, in fact, the Ethiopians have a lot of different texts. And in some places, they were the only people in the world who preserved these texts. And they were only discovered by the Western world, like in the 19th, 20th century. What difference it actually makes in what they do? Probably not so much. Partly because for long centuries, what they did was kind of confined to educated elites. There wasn't much outreach to ordinary people. And what that did in practice was it left the ground wide open for Protestant and Pentecostal churches in Ethiopia, who are now equal to or who actually outnumber the main historic Ethiopian church. One thing that really strikes me is if you look at history, there are Christian traditions that you see manifested maybe in the 2nd century, in the 6th century, in the 10th century, and there's no obvious connection between them, but they're just what people end up doing. So, the idea of women suddenly prophesying, and I emphasize women, giving these messages from God. Well, you see that in the 2nd century, but you'll see that showing up in all sorts of later eras. Just give you an example. One of the great novels, if you ever want to read a kind of a mind-stretching book, in the 1890s, a Brazilian author called Euclides de Cunha wrote a book about a rebellion in a rural corner of Brazil. And you think, what has that got to do with anything? And it was an odd, prophetic, Pentecostal movement. And he knew enough to say, look, everything these people are doing would have fit exactly into the 2nd century, the 3rd century, the 4th century. And maybe this is just a corner of what Christians do naturally. And the church tries its best to stamp it out. And it'll do it for another couple of 100 years. But so many of the Christian heresies, as we call them, are going to be back. And maybe it'll take a few centuries, and some of them are going to be orthodox.
Wow.
The example I always choose is groups that say, "Our Mother who art in heaven." Oh, brother, is that a persistent idea?
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, I think Jerome quoted the gospel to the Hebrews, and it says, "The Holy Spirit, who is my mother, pulled me by the hairs of my head, dragged me on out to the wilderness to be tempted by the devil." I mean, that also calls to mind for me. I think the stories of the first desert fathers, I believe, possibly Saint Anthony himself, they say something to the tune of, the priesthood is corrupt, the bishops are corrupt, and we, the desert monks, are essentially the inheritors or proper possessors of the apostolic mantle now. And so, and I can't remember who said it because I just encountered the idea recently, but it's in the tradition, and these are canonized saints, but they themselves are claiming, or someone is claiming about them, that they are the rightful ministers of the apostolic tradition, and they weren't ordained. And we live in an era where the current Catholic Church, the current iteration, right, says you got to be there on Sunday morning to accept the Eucharist and receive communion. These guys in the desert were probably not doing that, and if they were receiving communion, they were celebrating it themselves, and they were unordained and doing the whole thing. I mean, some of those are assumptions. You don't happen to know about that. Do you know what they're doing in the desert yourself?
In the desert, I think there are actual kind of ordained priests among the monks, but it's a very, very different kind of tradition. And again, it's a very enduring one, which, like many things in the early church, almost certainly goes back to radical sectarian Jewish roots. If you look where the sectarian Jewish monks, please hear the air quotes around that, are in the 1st century BC, it's very much the same part of the world where the first Christian monks are 200 and 300 years later. So they've got their own particular traditions.
Yeah, I believe Jacob Needleman wrote a similarly titled book, Lost Christianity or Lost Christianities or something to the tune. And I believe this is contested, but in the book he alleges that he's speaking to a Sinite priest or some sort of elder in a Mount Sinai hidden Christian tradition, which in the book seems sort of sensational. But in your book, you talk about, Syriac Christianity and where it came from, where it's going. And I think to some extent, those separatist, potentially radical pre-Christian groups, out in the desert, that some say were the precursors to either the Essenes or the whichever group John the Baptist was in, right? So all these revelations, purely because a couple kids dug up old scrolls, Dead Sea Scrolls, they're bringing into light an entire hermeneutic of the Hebraic tradition that maybe we haven't thought about for thousands of years, at least in the general noosphere of Western Christendom, and possibly the global South isn't thinking about these things too much right now, Dead Sea Scrolls and whatnot. But I can't help but wonder how much language and the poetry of Aramaic and Syriac lent itself to whatever Jesus was trying to say personally and the apostles were trying to say, versus how it was translated and how the Greco-Roman world took off with it and created their own spin and then went into different lands. How much do you think that initial change from Aramaic/Syriac into Greek and then Latin affected the transmission of the original ideas?
The main impression I have on that is I'd say there are 4 key languages in the early church. There's the ones you mentioned plus Coptic. And it is a very, very late turnover. I mean, if you were to look at planet Earth as it was around the year 1000, the sheer volume of literature and major literature in Christianity is probably as great in Syriac as in Greek still. There is still a huge amount of Coptic out there, much of which, by the way, is still untranslated today. And Latin is really the poor relative. The sheer volume of Syriac writing and how they preserve it. There are direct lines from this vast outpouring in the 4th, 5th centuries right up until the 13th and 14th. And the collapse of Syriac Christianity is really something that happens in the 13th and 14th century, not much before. And as I say, the Copts have their own ideas, and the Ethiopians are the heirs of the Church of Alexandria. So right there, you've got a number of very distinctive Christian traditions going, and the famous one, as you might call it, the Latin one, is the poor relation.
Mm. Yeah. Do you feel that the how do I put it? It seems to me like you're almost implying that the Roman Catholic Church was sort of the least likely candidate to have become what it became. Is that what you're saying?
I'm using my words carefully. Don't forget the whole idea of the Roman Catholic Church. There is the Great Church, which in the early centuries would certainly include the churches in Egypt and Syria and Iraq and so on. Then you've got a couple of major splits in the 6th century. You get the Church of the East, so-called Nestorian Church, which in fact isn't Nestorian theologically. It's very much like a regular Catholic Church. And you get these kind of schisms, but they're all pursuing generally a great church Christianity. They might differ on accepting, this gospel, this epistle doesn't make a whole lot of difference. And the people who are the real outliers, like some of the Gnostics, they carry on in small areas, and they carry on all the way through. But generally, the great church remains great. And it's only in what we would call the High Middle Ages that the Roman Catholic Church really heads off on its own. If there's a split, it's in the 11th, 12th centuries, which is after the midway point in the history of the Church, if you think about it.
Mm-hmm. So do you feel, there's so many factors I would connect with these things, but communications being what they are today and access to information, coupled with, whatever role we can say that the Vatican really plays in global Christianity, and the fact that Vatican II sort of, I always joke, wave the white flag and say the Reformation won. We're going to let you do a lot of things you weren't allowed to do before. And then couple that together with the rediscovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi. I feel like it's possible we're in a melting pot sort of moment where there might be whole new forms of Christianity emerging purely from internet consumption, let alone, in regions of the world where it's happening in person for different reasons. What do you think of that?
If you look at religious change, religious speculation, a huge amount is happening, obviously, on the internet. Religion was one of the very first subjects that, took over the internet. As they always said, religion took to the internet like a duck takes to orange sauce. And so you can get all these alternative texts. There are all these whole movements, but I would also add that the main beneficiary of the internet and different kinds of global media, like cable television and satellite television, have been a lot more orthodox. So, for example, you have Muslim televangelists who are based in Britain, and they have this vast market through the whole Muslim world. But what they're preaching is very orthodox, mainstream Islam. Ditto for African churches. They might be based in London or in Hamburg, and they speak to Africa. But what they're talking isn't getting into any kind of weird heresies or scriptures. It is fairly standard Pentecostal, prophetic stuff. So maybe the bias there is more to the Orthodox and mainstream in a rather surprising kind of way. There's almost like a law of conservation of orthodoxy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so to me too, orthodoxy is a very relative term, mainly to the times, and so maybe mainstream is the term to really hone in on there, which to me almost says that orthodoxy is a matter of, de facto. What are people saying right now? What are the theologians saying? What are people talking about the most? What are people doing the most? Right. Because once you have those numbers, it tends to be orthodox in the moment. I mean, Arius was orthodox in the moment, temporarily. He had the numbers. And along those lines, then, what are the trends right now when you're talking about a new Christendom? You talk a lot about how it is in the global South. Sure. There's really a lot going on there. So in America, when people think of Christendom, they're either, people who love Lord of the Rings and want to see Rome rise again, or they're, more Bible Belt Protestants who are more on the Christian nationalism side of things. What does it look like in the global South? People's maybe geopolitical conception of what Christianity can do once they have power, right?
Yeah. What people are seeing is what the missionaries tried to tell them about, and they're rather puzzled that the European missionaries aren't more pleased to see what they're up to in terms of spreading very fast, being very kind of traditional in terms of moral politics, sexual morality. Were you to go to a major Christian service in many global South countries, in an African country, it would feel very different, but mainly in terms of the sheer volume of the people there. Crusades, revivals, night gatherings with hundreds of thousands of people are not at all unusual. And if you're used to Pentecostal faith, if you're used to very kind of prophetic-oriented churches in the United States or Europe, you wouldn't be terribly surprised. So it's not that there's like a qualitative difference in the nature of the faith. It's just a matter of the sheer appeal and the speed with which is growing. I'd add one thing, also its relationship to the state. One thing we tend to forget when we look at the histories of Christianity is how often through history the normal state of Christian believers is as discriminated against Christian minorities or even majorities in societies ruled by other religions. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of most American Christians, European Christians, think of the state as a natural ally or have. No, very different kind of idea.
And in a world where monarchy is never quite as simple as people make it seem, but in a world where the king is in charge, you go up and try to convert that king. And I suppose the role of the state now, seeing as a lot of these places are democracies, at least nominally, or democracy adjacent, I would imagine that evangelism becomes a much more important mission when they're trying to get that majority, trying to get that vote.
Right. And I just step back here, as I come back to the idea of the people lead and the evangelists and the missionaries follow. One thing we tend to underestimate is the sheer role of numbers in driving Christian growth. I mean, partly a lot more people have been converted to Christianity, fine, great, but also the overall population that has been converted is vastly, vastly bigger. If you want to understand African Christianity, here's a figure. Back in 1900, there were 3 Europeans for every African. By 2050, there'll be 3 Africans for every European. As literally, the world is upside down. If you go from having a few Christians in Africa to having a large proportion, that means that you can't avoid moving towards the first time in history, which we'll be facing shortly, when Africa will have 1 billion Christians. And by the way, 2026 is a very interesting year. it'll be the first year in history when there'll be more Catholics in Africa than in Europe.
Wow.
And a few years after that, more in Africa than in Latin America.
The first time since when, would you say?
Ever.
Ever. Wow. Okay. And so what do you think that's going to lead to? One thing leads to another.
Well, within the Catholic... within the Catholic Church, obviously, they've been aware of this for a long time. They've tried to make all kind of adjustments. They've tried to make sure that there are more and more African cardinals, for example. Mm-hmm. But you can't go fast enough. You can't appoint them fast enough.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes said that the biggest problem the Catholic Church faces, and you can finish that sentence lots of ways, is that the Vatican is 2,000 miles too far north.
Wow. Yeah, I wonder about that. When I was a young Christian, I always wondered how did Rome become so important when Christianity originated in Jerusalem? And of course, I didn't know the history at all, the wars and whatnot. But by the same token, you kind of wonder why Rome, in America, why isn't the Pope not just American, but why isn't the papacy based in America? Someone might think now from an American-centric viewpoint, and what you're saying is another step more in the future. So, do you see Christendom when you talk about Christendom? First of all, define Christendom for our viewers.
Yeah. I'm trying to use the word carefully. A lot of historians use it for the idea of a close alliance between church and state. And that's not what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about the idea of a world in which states are often very weak. And what unites people around the world as they travel a lot is the fact of Christianity. So when you have like Nigerians, for example, country I study a lot, whether they're in Nigeria or they're in the United States or in France or Britain, what unites them is their Nigerianness, but also their religion. So when they're in Houston, which is the Nigerian capital of the United States, what you see is these amazing Nigerian Christian churches. So it's the idea of trampling borders. It might be that we're going into a world now which is more protectionist, more marked by hard borders, maybe. But when I talk about Christendom, that's what I mean, where your primary allegiance is to the religion and it just straddles states.
I mean, that seems very much baked into the cake of, mere Christianity, as we say. And it also sounds like you're describing a sort of unnecessarily ecumenical Christendom, insofar as it's our mere Christianity that brings us together. And all right, so because you're not strictly speaking about the marriage of the church and state type of Christendom, that sort of leads to my next question. Then, I mean, is Christendom something that people are trying to establish? This new Christendom, is it something that people are actively pursuing? And if so, by what means and with what visions?
I would say not particularly. I mean, if you take it in like the older formal sense of the very tight lines between church and state, then you could say that Christian nationalism is about trying to create a Christendom, and that's obviously not what I'm talking about. So, I don't want to push it. I don't want to make out that, there are millions of people around the world signing up for, the army of Christendom. But I think of the Middle Ages, where states may come, states may go. There might be a nation of Bavaria or Aquitaine or Wessex, and everyone knows they're going to be around for a couple of hundred years, then they vanish. But the church remains. If you are in a global south country today, the state you're in may or may not be here for a century, but your religion will be.
It seems that, the past 2,000 years of Christendom, if we just want to call it that, has always wrestled with the question of what constitutes Christian identity, knowing that the state changes so much, especially because we're dealing with a religion that claims its founder is the King of Kings. There is this sort of dominionist approach to things. So you do sort of end up wrestling with that idea of, well, is Jesus king of my country? Is he king of me? What happens if my country or my community changes, or someone else comes in and is more directly in charge of affairs? What does that mean for my Christian identity? Is that more along the lines of what you think people are trying to sort out?
I think, for example, if you go to a typical American Catholic church, they will have an American flag. And they don't mean anything, aggressive or super nationalist by that. It's just the natural thing that your religious values combine with your patriotic values. Mm-hmm. Fine, I fully respect that idea. But other people, and not just on the kind of extreme religious fringe, may say, no, that's the state. That's not the church. We need to keep them apart.
Now, speaking of church and state, did I read that you were a consultant for the intelligence community on something related to this?
I've worked with them for some years. What was happening, and this is very kind of non-classified, so I'm happy to talk about this. They did a lot of work on projecting the realities of 15 or 20 years ahead. So in 2000, they did a report on predicting 2015. What was apparent was they really were not taking account of religion. And, back in 2000, 2005, they were suddenly going, oh, my Lord, 9/11, we're not paying attention to this. And so they drew a number of religious experts like myself to build in more of a religious element into that. If you try to understand world history in the past 20 years without taking account of religion, you're an idiot. So we were just trying to incorporate that. So I was doing that kind of work.
That seems very important. We're right now in the midst of, Trump just dropped 3 bunker busters on alleged nuclear facilities in Iran. And for the lead up to it, and ever since, the religious communities are talking about it in eschatological terms. Right. So some people, Christians, dispensationalists, are saying this is it. This is that big battle in whichever verse of whichever chapter. And, my channel focuses a lot on preterism. So I'm out there doing damage control, saying, folks, let's not superimpose first century stories on God knows what's happening now. This is its own moment. However, one gets concerned that fallible people, might be drawing up blueprints based on what they think is a blueprint in the Bible. So, religion can influence people to see milestones, eschatological milestones, where maybe they aren't, in my opinion, I should say. And it could also drive them to pursue eschatological goals. So some people, I've heard in so many conversations in the past week, Christians of a more dispensational bent saying, this is scary, but thank God it's happening, because once this war really blows up, we know Jesus is coming back, and we'll celebrate that, and we want that to happen. So we want this war to happen. I mean, you can tell what my opinion on that is, of course.
Right.
In terms of trends, what are you seeing as the new Christendom, marches forward in the global South, and with this Catholic majority coming in Africa? What do they believe about the future from a religious point of view, and how might that affect how they go about creating their communities?
Well, as I said, there are lots of different denominations, some of which are very prophetic. Like I say, you have Anglicans and Methodists and Baptists and Catholics who, generally would be very much identifiable with the people of those denominations you have next door to you. You're going to find some people who are very dispensationalist and very apocalyptic. The great majority of regular people are not. They believe in miracles. They believe in healing. Apocalypse, not so much a key doctrine. I will tell you one thing which is interesting. If you work with aid agencies in, say, Africa or Southeast Asia, you've got areas that are subject to all these disasters. You're always having to bring in lots of aid. And the aid agencies love dealing with the apocalyptic and otherworldly groups because they tend to be the best organized. They tend to be the people you can actually rely on, and they're very, very committed. And so, great. It's a crazed apocalyptic sect that believes the world is going to end in 2 years' time. These are the people we want to talk to, and we can trust them.
I see. So these are the preppers, basically, doomsday preppers. Is that the type of organization?
Just use an example in the United States. Very respectable church is the Mormons.
Mm-hmm.
Mormons insist on their members being preppers. You're meant to have all this stuff in your basement. Mm-hmm. In Salt Lake, they've got these incredible reserves of stuff for a disaster that may not happen. When something like Hurricane Katrina happened a few years ago, they brought all these refugees to Salt Lake, and Salt Lake could turn out, you want 50,000 diapers in 10 minutes? Sure, we can do that.
Wow.
So being a prepper does not prevent somebody being a very real-world oriented, business-oriented, sane person. I have huge respect for the Mormons.
Mm-hmm.
But by any conventional definition, what do they believe in? They believe in prophetic ideas, these very apocalyptic ideas that for many Christians are very strange, but they're very kind of hard-nosed and deliberate, and they do superb aid around the world.
Mm. I always found it somewhat paradoxical that someone who believes the end is nigh would find any reason to prepare anything, right? It's
there's different concepts of the millennium. If you believe you're going to have 10 years or 100 years of chaos, and you read the other Jenkins and LaHaye, and you know about all these end times, well, you better have a good collection of shotguns downstairs.
True. And add to that zombies, because
that's my interesting.
Yeah, so we always have to worry about the zombies.
Right.
Now, I as I was researching you, I didn't get to it, but you have a book called The New Anti-Catholicism, The Last Acceptable Prejudice. Tell our listeners a little bit about that.
Yeah, I wrote that over 20 years ago. And I'm describing it almost like as a historic document. Not that anti-Catholicism is not very strong today, but my argument is if you look through American history, anti-Catholicism is an extremely, extremely powerful force. It manifests itself in all these multi-million person movements. And the idea was it had largely kind of faded away, and JFK got elected president in 1960. But what I was writing about was the way in which criticism of, for example, the Catholic Church over clergy sex abuse, legitimate criticism spilled over into very, very traditional anti-Catholic ideas. And as I said, it was an acceptable prejudice. And as I said, then you could be prejudiced against them and nobody else. You couldn't say bad things, particularly about Muslims or Jews, and you could make racial comments, but you can get away with comments about Catholics that are mind-boggling, and particularly in terms of how they reflect this long historical tradition. And I'd say things have changed a bit, but that is still true to some extent. I mean, you'll get like stand-up comics saying things about the church and the priesthood and the papacy, which they would never dream of saying about any other religious group or ethnic group.
That's an interesting point. I mean, I was brought up pretty agnostic in a culturally Jewish household, but also my father was sort of a lapsed Irish Catholic. And I went on a choir trip in high school to the Vatican, and someone bought, a a rosary, and somehow it just seemed normal to me to take that rosary, throw it on the ground, and make some self-righteous statement about, like, didn't Jesus say something about not turning his temple into a gift shop type of thing?
Right.
And by the time I became a Protestant pastor, you almost never give a sermon on some of the basics like justification or prayer, or without sort of ribbing the Catholics for all these assumed religious improprieties. They pray too much. They have rote prayer. They have a pope. A man in charge. I wonder now, because there's all these headlines coming out that Generation Z is much more traditional and they're flocking to the Catholic Church. Do you think that is a headline and a PR stunt, or do you think that's real and there's a reason for it?
Yeah, you're certainly seeing something. You're seeing a kind of bounce in that way, and particularly in Europe, where if you were to hold more traditional Latin masses, very conservative Latin masses, you would need much larger churches, and particularly full of like 24-year-old people. That is a real youth movement. How long that can last, I'm not sure. And you're seeing a little bit of it in the United States. For instance, Chartres in France had this big pilgrimage with like 20,000 people, and the average age was about 25. Very, very conservative bunch of people. Something is happening there. The main thing that's happened in recent years. I won't go into this in great detail, but the clergy sex abuse issue has really taken over all other kinds of the arsenal of prejudice. And so you have like a legitimate and proper critique of the church, together with assumptions about clergy sex behavior that were exactly the sort of thing that were the mainstreams of American life in the 1840s, 1850s, 1890s, 1920s. It just kind of never went away. Do
you think that this trend, it seems primarily, European American, this is more of a theological question, but do you think it's theologically compatible with the type of Christianities that people in the global South are flocking to? Are they going to start arguing even though they could potentially lock arms, is sort of what I'm getting at.
Yeah, sure. But one of the biggest differences with global South churches are debates between Christians are strongly constrained by the fact that there are much bigger enemies outside. Mm-hmm. If you live in a country like Nigeria, which is 50% Muslim, 50% Christian, and there are a lot of Muslim terror groups, then, Anglicans, Catholics, Presbyterians, Mormons all have a great deal in common. And, why would I shout at you when we have this guy over here who's trying to kill us? Mm-hmm. Or in India, for example, you have these denominations, and their great issue is Hindu fundamentalism.
Yeah, something you don't hear much about. You really don't. Yeah,
large and very, very dangerous movement for Christians and Muslims and others. If you have the government of one of the most powerful countries in the world that believes that all non-Hindu religions are the descendants of people who are either invaders or who are forcibly converted, and our job is to get them back to what they should be. There are no legitimate Indian Christians or Indian Muslims. And there are, 200 million Indian Muslims? That's a huge and deeply, deeply dangerous situation.
Now, in Iran, there's a claim that there are hundreds of thousands of people converting to the Christian faith every day. I'm seeing this trending on X, and I don't really trust anything I see on X. Iran is a traditionally, Christian society in certain eras of history. What's the Middle East look like right now? Where do you think it's going?
All right. Well, just to take Iran, The big trend in Iran is really the very, very sharp decline of the official Shiite Islam that is held by the government. And over the years, they've issued some just amazing statements about the number of mosques there are in Iran and the number that are actually used. And it's a tiny, tiny fraction. The Muslim clergy, Shiite clergy, are very, very unpopular. And that means there's been a reaction. A lot of people go to slightly heterodox Sufi movements that the clergy don't like. Some people go to Christian churches. I don't think a large number. But most people, I think, go very secular. I think Iran potentially, if it was left alone, if the present government collapsed, in a few years would be one of the most secular countries in the Middle East, maybe in the world. It would look very European. I mean, that's the impression you get from their fertility rates. You can tell a lot about a country and its religion. Fertility rates. Very religious countries have very high fertility rates, and vice versa. Iran, in 25 years, has gone from having one of the highest fertility rates in the world to one of the lowest. Mm. And what that almost certainly means is people are much, much more secular. They're not responding to traditional, calls for morality and religion and so on. And particularly if it's, that damn Muslim cleric over there. The anti-clericalism in Iran is massive.
That's something I didn't expect to hear because of the paintings we're being given, the portraits of things. Yeah. So, well, that's fascinating. The Middle East, of course, is a focal point of people's eschatological projections, and I can't help but think that the folks who are actually living there are dead tired of that type of thinking.
Oh, sure.
Is there, amongst the people living there, is there a prevailing opinion on eschatology? Do people live there in constant expectation that their good guy is about to swoop in and save them, or their worst adversaries, that type of thing?
Okay, well, the main Christian communities actually are kind of interesting. Syria is the traditional heartland, and that, of course, has been catastrophically hit by the civil war, the rise of Islamic fanaticism. There are a number of Christians in Israel. The general answer to your question is no. I mean, these are not apocalyptic at all. You get some people who go there, and Westerners often acquire what's called Jerusalem syndrome, and they suddenly decide that they're the Messiah and they have to go spread the word. And I'm not kidding. Israeli psychiatrists have special pages in the manual about how to respond about that. The most interesting thing for me about the Middle East is the phenomenal growth of Christianity in the Arabian Peninsula, in the United Arab Emirates, in Abu Dhabi and Kuwait, and nobody mentioned this, in Saudi Arabia, where they're not meant to be. They brought in all these immigrants to do the work. They brought in people from South India and the Philippines, and suddenly discovered that they had these very, very large Catholic and Oriental Orthodox populations who might run to like 10% of the population. And God bless them, and I use the phrase advisedly, countries like the UAE have been incredibly generous, and they've helped build cathedrals for these people. And the rule is, worship all you like, do not convert Muslims. Fine, we'll do that. But in terms of eschatology, no, they're interested in liturgy. They're interested in living their Christian lives. And that's another example of what I started at the beginning, which is how Christianity spreads not by mission. If you go as a Christian missionary to these places, you'll be kicked out in no time. Mm-hmm. But if you and a few 100,000 of your friends arrive and want to worship in churches, then you've set up a Christian community by accident.
Those are wise words, and you're probably not going to hear that from, your next missionary pitch. Hey, put your money in this, missionary mission, etc. That's really fascinating. Well, we're getting to the close of the hour, and I'll ask you more of the classic personal questions, so you can kind of take us home. Now, you're a man of faith, according to Wikipedia. Catholic. Then you go to Episcopal Church. Is that correct?
Right. Yep, exactly.
So I'm going to try to take the two topics of lost Christianity and Christendom, try to get you to bookend them. So, you personally, what is your favorite or most stimulating, exciting, curious form of lost Christianity that you've encountered? What does it tell you about what the church is in the big picture, and how does it inspire you about what the church could be, or what Christianity and Christendom can be in our future?
That is so broad a question. I'm just going to talk about one particular work and one particular tradition, which is one thing the Syriac Church is brilliant on, is what's called pseudepigrapha. That is, they write these books in the name of Old Testament prophets, and they circulate forever. And ideally live one called the Cave of Treasures. And it was written in the 5th and 6th century by a Syriac author, and it still goes around. And it is incredibly influential on all Eastern churches. And it tells the whole story of the Bible from the point of view of this cave. And every character in the New Testament, when they have to get treasure, or they have to get something for a bride, or they hide something away, or they bury someone, they always do it in this cave. And this cave is the motif. And it culminates at the crucifixion, of course, which happens on the rock over this cave. And a large part of Syriac art will show the crucifixion. And underneath it, you see the cave with the skull of Adam. And you have the whole Christian message and the whole Old Testament message in one. And it is just such a mind-boggling way of looking at the Old Testament. Where do the wise men get the treasures? Where else? The Cave of Treasures. And it is kind of obsessively brilliant. But that passage with the crucifixion above the cave and Christ's blood flows down and revives the skull of Adam. Isn't that mind-boggling?
That's beautiful.
When you see the Old Testament in a totally different way, and it integrates it into the whole salvation history in a way that very few Western or Catholic authors ever really succeed in doing.
I agree, because as someone who is sort of catechized by just the hurdy-gurdy American tradition, a little bit here, a little bit there, you never had the sense, at least I didn't, that there was a through line, and it wasn't until later that someone pitched to me the idea that the kingdom of God was in Eden, just that simple idea. And, I'd heard of the Cave of Treasures, but I don't know if I've read it, but that is that image that has since sort of taken more root in my mind, of that the river of life is flowing through history, and it's the Logos, or it's Christ, or it's Sophia, or it's wisdom. Or in this case, it's a cave of treasures. That's really beautiful. And it sounds to me like we'll just have to dig right back into that cave to keep people happy.
Sounds good.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much for your time, Philip Jenkins. Is there any place that you would like to send my listeners to look at your work, or any works that you'd like to recommend?
Boy, I wrote one book called Crucible of Faith, which is about how Christianity grew out of the whole world of sectarian Judaism and the continuities there. And that really tries to indicate the Gnostics and the Dead Sea Scrolls and Nag Hammadi and so on. And I was kind of rather proud of doing that. But that's the one that I suppose I would cite. But obviously, like anyone who writes, my favorite book is always the one I'm doing right now.
Yeah, what are you working on right now?
It's a book about empire. It's a book about American empire and its relationship to religion, how American empire shapes religion, how religion shapes American empire, and maybe you and I can talk about it down the road.
We're going to have to talk about it again. I'm going to pick up Crucible of Faith, and then we'll probably have to talk about that, because that sounds up my alley.
Sounds good.
Fantastic. Thanks again, Philip Jenkins. God bless it to everyone who's listening. Thank you for listening. Check out Philip Jenkins' work, and may your faith be edified, and keep on keeping on, guys. Peace.